Testing. Good evening. Good evening. My name is Monica Antonelli, and I would like to welcome you to tonight's event at Minnesota State University, Mankato. We're grateful to have you here. During the sesquicentennial, we celebrate our rich campus history, which has shaped the university we have today. I encourage you to also attend other upcoming sesquicentennial events, including the Birthday Bash celebration on Saturday, October 6th. At this time, I would like to extend thanks to our former library dean, Dr. Joan Roca, Provost Dr. Marilyn Wells, and Associate Provost Dr. Bobby Fleischman for their support of tonight's film, 2 Weeks in May. In addition, we would like to recognize the work of the students, faculty, staff, and alumni who tell this remarkable story. This was a Minnesota State Mankato student film project from start to finish. The documentary took over a year to complete and uses historic photos, documents, newspapers, recorded audio, film footage, and interviews to convey the turmoil and animation of the student anti-Vietnam War protest at Mankato State College. 2 Weeks in May is based on events described in the book Out of Chaos. This is a story that happened at Mankato State College 46 years ago, during the months of April and May in 1972. The film documents the leadership of Emeritus Mankato State College President, Dr. James F. Nickerson, and also the actions of student leaders from that time. After the showing, we will have a discussion with a panel of former Minnesota State Mankato students and faculty. Would you like to wave at the crowd? There's our panel, and they're going to join us on stage for a discussion. And this discussion and this film is being recorded and broadcast. And for all of you who would like to take the film home with you, DVDs are available for sale for the low price of only $10. So that's a real deal. To continue to provide quality programs at Minnesota State Mankato, Library Services needs your feedback. So we ask that you complete the short survey about tonight's events. Please take a few minutes before you leave to fill it out, and we'll be collecting the surveys at the doors at the end of the evening. This film was made possible through funding provided by Library Services, with additional funding support from the Department of English and a grant provided by the Prairie Lakes Art Council from funds appropriated by the Minnesota State Legislature. And finally, we take this opportunity to recognize that we live, work, and learn in the homeland of the Dakota people, whose language frames our name, Minnesota State University, Mankato. Thank you.
March every man, march every girl, march like it's you's gonna change the world. A reason to fight, a reason to fear. Go home now, we'll take it from here. Shouting loud enough, telling good men to kill. Flowers are filling up your side of the hill. In battles on bridges, you made yourself clear. You took your best shot. We'll take it from here.
The 1960s were a time of unprecedented change, optimism, and turmoil. With the introduction of the pill at the start of the decade, the sexual revolution was introduced. Harvard lecturer and researcher Timothy Leary began to experiment with hallucinogens and would later encourage people to turn on, tune in, and drop out. Interest in communal living, environmentalism, spiritual consciousness, and rock music soon followed. A cultural revolution was underway.
It was the young versus the old. The long hairs versus the working people. There was a lot of good-looking girls, there was a lot of beer, there was a lot of reefer. School was fun. We listened to the Beatles.
Yeah. Yes.
That was our savior. We listened to the Beatles.
In the political arena, John F. Kennedy, America's new young president, instilled the country with a sense of enthusiasm and hopefulness. However, the United States soon found itself engulfed in grief when his life came to a tragic end following his assassination on November 22, 1963. Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Johnson, dedicated his presidency to fulfilling and even expanding JFK's unfinished legacy. The Johnson administration boldly pushed forward comprehensive civil rights legislation and a war on poverty. By the end of the 1960s, the United States awakened to find itself entangled in an escalating foreign war, which would later come to dominate the public's awareness.
1968 and 69, there was 500,000 troops in Vietnam. If you were a male between the ages of 18 and 20, you were either in school, in the army, or dead. I had no choice.
I couldn't stay silent while my country was wreaking havoc over there in that small Southeast Asian country. It just didn't make sense to me. Even if you could justify it morally, it was all out of proportion to any threat you could possibly conceive. And so the only reason, as I understand it, that we stayed in there was our reputation. Teddy Roosevelt made us policemen of the hemisphere. Truman made us the policemen of the world. And we were supposed to guarantee the freedom of other peoples, at least freedom from communism. And if we pulled out, they said, here we are, the mightiest country in the world. No one would believe that we would defend others elsewhere. You know, we had to keep up this front that we were the guarantor. We couldn't lose credibility. And who wants to die for that?
When James F. Nickerson took the reins as the new president of Mankato State College in July 1966, the college was rapidly expanding. An upper campus had been established to supplement and eventually supersede the original lower campus. New buildings had been built or were on the drawing board. New programs were proposed, and enrollment was growing so fast it was a problem hiring enough staff to keep up. It was also a time of social unrest at the college. which was directed in part by minority students, women, and LGBT groups asserting their rights on campus and demanding equality. In addition, changes in policies affecting students' daily life, including dress codes, visitors' privileges, co-ed dorms, and freedom of publication, were being implemented. The year 1968 marked a significant change in perceptions about the war. In February, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong attempted to bring a decisive end to the war by launching a surprise attack on South Vietnam's major cities during Tet, the Lunar New Year. Although U.S. and South Vietnamese troops repelled the communist offensive, more and more Americans began to view the war as a stalemate. With his poll numbers dropping, President Lyndon B. Johnson chose not to run for re-election, and Richard M. Nixon went on to secure the 1968 presidential election by implying that he had a secret plan to win the war in Vietnam, which would bring peace with honor.
To you, the great silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask for your support. I pledged in my campaign for the presidency to end the war in a way that we could win the peace.
Well, you know, he was elected in 68 on the basis that he had a plan to end the war. He had a secret plan that if we elected him, he might let us in on, And I was tearing my hair out at that time. I mean, how foolish can you be to buy into something like that?
Although President Nixon hoped that intimidating Hanoi would lead to negotiations that would end the war on terms enabling South Vietnam to survive, the North Vietnamese refused to back down from their goal of national reunification. President Nixon then decided to gradually withdraw American soldiers from Vietnam while simultaneously turning over the main burden of fighting the war to the South Vietnamese. Under this effort to Vietnamize the war, the United States supplied an expanded South Vietnamese army with vast supplies of modern weaponry.
At this point, President Nixon, Richard M. Nixon is president, and he is looking to, first of all, wind down the war and get the United States out. So he is slowly withdrawing American troops in the Vietnamization process. He needs to buy time for this. The Vietnamization process means you slowly take American troops out of South Vietnam while at the same time bolstering the South Vietnamese military.
The concern about Vietnam was big, very big.
In order to buy time for the Vietnamization policy, Nixon announced in April 1970 that American and South Vietnamese troops would cross the border into neighboring Cambodia to eliminate communist sanctuaries. By expanding the war in Southeast Asia, the Cambodian Incursion reignited anti-war protests on college campuses in the United States.
In the state of Ohio, Kent State, and shot 4 people, wounded several others. About 10 days later in May, I think there was middle of May, Jackson State, which was pretty much a black campus at the time, was also, people were also killed there. A couple of people were killed there. All of this eruption and demonstrations were a result of the invasion, which didn't turn out to be very successful.
At Kent State University, anti-war demonstrations prompted the Ohio governor to dispatch 900 National Guardsmen to the campus. On May 4, 1970, the National Guard, after an unsuccessful effort to disperse a crowd of demonstrators, shot and killed 4 students. In the aftermath of the killings at Kent State, students and professors at hundreds of colleges across the United States, including Mankato State College, went on strike.
Well, that's actually sort of what triggered my involvement, but there'd been more protests going on for a couple years already, more than that even if you go back to some of the smaller ones. And Kent State kind of just went without a lot of fanfare. I mean, everyone was amazed and disgusted. But what happened, I think it was 8 days later, in Jackson State, several more students were shot. And the Black Student Union, an organization of the black students up at Mankato State, and there's probably only about 125 of them at the time. I mean, they kept a pretty good count of them because there were so few and so isolated. They got out and basically mobilized the campus, and that started the first really big anti-war protests up on campus. I mean, the classes ended up shutting down more or less that spring. And there were a lot of community protests, and it was actually the Black Student Union and Jackson State that was the catalyst. I mean, people were all ready to go after Kent State, but that was, sort of the breaking point, at least here. And someone took the bull by the horns and got out there with megaphones and rallied people, and it took off from there.
By spring 1972, there was very little evidence that the Vietnamization policy was working. When the North Vietnamese launched a new offensive in March that penetrated deep into South Vietnam with little resistance, Nixon feared that South Vietnamese forces might collapse. To stop the North Vietnamese from steamrolling further into South Vietnam, Nixon ordered the resumption of full-scale bombing of North Vietnam in April. A month later, the president announced that he had approved both the mining of Haiphong Harbor and a naval blockade of North Vietnam. At Mankato State College, Mitchell Goodman, a writer and activist from the East Coast, who had been hired as the campus chair of ideas, began to make his presence felt. Goodman is probably best known for organizing an anti-draft protest that led to the trial of the Boston Five in 1968. The trial made Mitchell Goodman and his co-defendants heroes in the anti-war movement and ignited protest rallies around the country.
I don't like leaders. I don't like Mr. Nixon, the emperor.
You need a leader because you divide otherwise.
But that's a difficult political question. Look, go back a few years. At the time that I and some other people who were not susceptible to the draft were trying to build a draft resistance movement, how could we become leaders to young guys who knew already what they had to do? In federal district court, they told us, you led the draft resistance movement. That's nonsense. We said to the judge and to the prosecutor, look, we weren't leading anything simply because we were responsible people. We said to those young men, you have to resist the draft. We will support you. But no, we're not going to lead you. We're not your fathers. You're grown-up young men. You know what to do. You've got to learn how to lead yourselves.
Upon his arrival, Goodman soon demonstrated that he either did not understand the conservative atmosphere of the Mankato community or that he had contempt for it. Goodman would come to be known by some as the Pied Piper of irresponsible radicalism.
Mitchell Goodman, in my judgment, I called him the Pied Piper of irresponsibility because he was urging students to become real revolutionaries without them really understanding, I think, what they were getting into. He was urging them to go out, do damage, break windows, make a statement, do whatever is necessary to attract attention. And who knows how much, the escalation there would be if you stopped cars and rapped on windows, and that caused an uproar in this town. If you threw fire bombs at the armory wall, which was kind of silly, you could burn the armory. And when they did that, other students walked up and they put the fire out. Most of the students were nonviolent. There was only the small core that were bent on mayhem, and they were encouraged by Mitchell Goodman.
On Sunday, April 17, 1972, in an open letter to students, Goodman wrote,
I came to Mankato because I was told this chair belonged to the students and it was meant to challenge the attitudes and participation of students and faculty alike. But how do you make that challenge in the face of widespread indifference to any ideas or actions? Time is short.
before he even got to campus, that, you know, his class was going to be used to organize anti-war activities, and some of us met with him before the class even started, but we had I think a 3-hour night class where that's what we did, and he in particular was viewed as an outside agitator, and, you know, I suppose in those days, even a communist or something by a lot of the community people. Even the university administration sort of scorned him because he was part of the university, but they really couldn't control him, and, you know, everything he did was in the name of the university because he was a professor, and we were even doing this as a class activity, so to speak. So, but he was very good at what he did, and you know, I think a lot of these things were largely spontaneous, but he did a lot to motivate this campus in the short time he was here.
A nationwide student strike was called for Friday, April 21st. Strike Day on the Mankato campus began with an uneasy start. Bad weather forced local strike activities into the student union, where 400 people were in attendance. Old Main, Armstrong, and Morris Halls had to be evacuated when liquid tear gas was dumped into the stairwells. At the student union, President Nickerson addressed the students and warned that incidents like the tear gassing would be counterproductive to their cause. But Goodman was at the rally too. He took the spotlight and professed,
If students are going to insist on keeping classes open, maybe we need a little tear gas to wake them up.
Mitchell Goodman was invited to the campus for the chair of ideas, a rather new and unique experiment in the college curriculum where outside people would be invited in to provide different points of view. He did exactly that. He provided a different point of view, and some loved him, some hated him. He was viewed as I don't know, a Pied Piper of sorts who was leading students into confrontations with authorities and with the community. But he, you know, to his credit, he made people think. He was provocative, and I think that's what the chair of ideas was supposed to be. Was he popular? No.
Nickerson's mail was beginning to reflect the growing divide between his campus and the community. One Mankato resident wrote Nickerson,
I would like to register a complaint with you in regard to the disruption of classes by the so-called peaceniks. I feel you are derelict in your job as a college president and have not done enough in regard to curbing and discouraging this type of activity. Students who want to get an education cannot do so if you allow these hoodlums to disrupt classes by tossing tear gas grenades into their classrooms. People like you who condone this permissive type of atmosphere should not be heads of educational institutions.
Nickerson thought it was important to respond to letters from community members. In reply, he wrote,
Your opinion is respected, but I cannot agree. First, classes were not forcibly disrupted by students. Peaceniks, as well as hawks, deserve a hearing. Those who dissent are not by definition hoodlums. We have no evidence against any persons who may have been involved in the tear gas incidents. I must choose between the policing of thought and suppression of peaceful demonstration inferred in your letter, and providing a campus which recognizes the necessity of hearing all sides. The right of opinion and argument, no matter how unpleasant and offensive. History will write which of us was closer to the truth.
He was given a lot of credit for not handling this from his office, but being out down in the streets with the students, at the rallies, talking to the students, listening to the students. He put together I believe, a cabinet of his own college administrators, but that included student members too, to get a pulse beat of what was going on at that time. So I think he was fully aware of student sentiments and attitudes, and at the same time sensitive to what was going on in the city of Mankato and North Mankato. He knew that he was walking a tightrope between the student wants and student desires and the
sensibilities of the people who lived in the community.
What was to come in the next month would bring the college and the city of Mankato to the edge of chaos. On Sunday, April 30th, Mankato's two VFW posts, the American Legion Post and the National Guard, held a Loyalty Day parade through the heart of Mankato.
It was pretty small. I think it was started by either the VFW or the American Legion. And then when they invited the Vets Club to participate, we then asked, well, what about us? We're veterans too. And they said, we'd rather not have you there because you're against the war. And they came close to calling us traitors. And so then we decided we'd go anyway. But like I said earlier, I don't like parades. I don't want to march in one. But there were quite a few, shall we say, anti-war veterans that did march in it. And they got the biggest applause when they came by.
The Mankato State College Vets for Peace organization, along with the regional Vietnam Veterans Against the War, decided to piggyback on to the event. More than 24 protesting veterans marched in the parade, wearing their military fatigues. Students lined the route and shouted, "Peace now," as a truck converted to look like a railroad engine carried World War II veterans with a loudspeaker blaring "The Stars and Stripes Forever."
The Vietnam Veterans Against the War were a pretty big part of that, and as time went on, they were a growing part. And I think a lot of them were the most belligerent anti-war protesters. They'd been there, and they had the credibility that a lot of us 19-year-olds didn't. No one could tell them, well, don't be a traitor, go and enlist in the military like you should. And they came back, and not many of them had anything good to say about Vietnam. They were divided too, but by and large, they were I think the most credible part of the whole anti-war movement. They were well organized, and they were very credible, and they were very visible at our protests. A lot of them would wear their uniforms, or at least their fatigues, and you really just couldn't give them much flack because they were there and they had firsthand information. And what could you say about that? And especially today, the Vietnam veterans are considered heroes and everything, and to some extent they were then too, although the war was quite unpopular, but they were a very active force. I mean, we had John Kerry on campus once when he was the head of the VVAW.
On Wednesday, May 3rd, college protesters conducted a torchlight march from the Upper Campus Mall to the post office. The protests continued the next day on May 4th with a warning from Abbas Kessel to Goodman to keep matters nonviolent.
America has traditionally been a nation of violence. Anyone commits an act of violence is responsible to society.
As usual, Goodman attacked his critic.
Every time I speak, Kessel comes up and confuses the issue. Closing down the university is not an act of violence.
Hired by Nickerson in 1966, Dr. Abbas Kessel, professor of political science, was one of the few international faculty on the campus at that time.
The stories I've heard were that Nickerson interviewed him for 4 hours, and then he hired him. And because he wasn't white at the time when he was hired, that was a big deal that he was hired at that time.
Abbas Gesalaya grew up in Tehran, Iran. In 1940, he shortened his surname to Kessel, which he officially adopted when he became a U.S. citizen in 1964.
Well, him and I came from the same background in Iran, but of course he was much older than me, but his academic credentials were just amazing. I mean, he was an electrical engineer who went to university from Berkeley, who decided to go to University of Chicago to become a political scientist. I mean, completely two different fields.
Throughout his tenure, Abbas Kessel would serve as the learned and eloquent voice of the Mankato State College anti-war movement. More than anyone else, it was Kessel who educated the campus on the tragedy of Vietnam and the actions of the U.S. government. On Wednesday, May 3rd, more than 800 students took part in a rally on the upper campus. After the speeches, the students marched down the hill to Old Main and the office of President Nickerson. Although Front Street was supposed to be off limits for this demonstration, the students walked down the middle of the street anyway, and then headed for the post office. The post office was a frequent rallying point for protests because it was the only federal building in the city. It was also home to U.S. military recruiters, along with the Selective Service.
We always used the post office as a place to protest because it was the only federal building in town. It may still be the only one in town, I don't know. But one time we decided that we wouldn't just stand outside the post office. We went in and disrupted business.
Students then responded with the sit-down strike on the lobby floor. The situation caused concern for Police Chief Charles Alexander, who routinely was present at most student demonstrations to make sure police response was measured and appropriate if things got out of hand. Respected by both college administration and begrudgingly by demonstrators, Alexander took precautions to assure there would not be needless violence on his watch. Activities heated up the following week. Monday, May 8, 1972, President Richard Nixon ordered the mining of North Vietnamese ports without consulting Congress, which intensified public opposition and outrage against the war. The next day, Tuesday, May 9th, anti-war student protests erupted on campuses across the United States, including Mankato State. The Daily Reporter printed a page-one map of Vietnam with the bold headline, "Strike, strike, 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 strike." Town and campus tensions were stretched to the limit. The atmosphere was explosive. There was talk in Mankato's blue-collar bars of retaliation against the protesters, particularly Goodman, whose anti-war and anti-establishment rhetoric pushed the envelope for them. To the working men and women of the town, the protesters increasingly were viewed as pampered college students led by an East Coast Svengali. Tuesday, May 9th, began with a bomb threat to Old Main, telephoned in at 6:45 a.m., effective at 10 a.m. Off-campus, authorities were on full alert after discovering heavy damage at the under-construction Blue Earth County Law Enforcement Center. In the early morning, a bomb blast of approximately 30 sticks of dynamite shattered the wall of the facility and caused extensive interior damage. Suspicions were that the bombing was tied to the anti-war protests, but was never confirmed. At 1 p.m., 3,000, and some say over 6,000 protesters marched down the hill to the heart of Mankato at Front and Main Streets. There, Goodman urged students to bring traffic to a standstill as a way of bringing the war home to residents. The crowd divided into three groups, one to block the North Star Bridge, one to block the Main Street Bridge, and one to stay at the intersection, cutting off traffic between Mankato and North Mankato. More than 1,000 students moved across the Main Street Bridge over the Minnesota River into North Mankato, and at 2 p.m. took control of Highway 169, the main north-south artery in south-central Minnesota. A massive traffic jam resulted as protesters held their position on the state highway for more than 3 hours. Cars and trucks were backed up for over 2 miles. Local law enforcement authorities from Nicollet County, North Mankato, and the State Patrol assembled at the north end of the student-controlled highway. Barricades were erected to keep the students from spreading out, and 50 helmeted officers stood on the other side with nightsticks in their hands.
we were down there when they broke off. Half of them went across into Nicollet County, across the bridge, which is a more conservative, less sympathetic environment. So I was with them. I was on the payroll at the time. I wasn't a student leader. So I was observing along with Kaminsky and Len Clauseway. But we got our share of tear gas.
Well, I was involved in organizing the protest, and I was involved in the protest. I don't know that when we started that, the plan was to go out on the highway. You know, some people say that was sort of the goal to start with. I think there were 2 different highway protests, unless they were just part of one. I know there was a bunch of people down by the North Star Bridge that had shut down the city from that side of town once, and maybe that was the same time, but yeah, I was involved in that. But you know, that was a nice, unseasonably warm spring day, and a lot more people showed up than usual. I mean, I think it was 5,000 or 6,000. There's a lot of estimates, but it was enough to pretty much tie up Mankato for several hours. And once we were there, I was involved with the Student Senate President, Larry Spencer, and President Nickerson. Larry and Jim Nickerson are both somewhat recently deceased, Larry about 3 years ago. And we were talking to the law enforcement people, trying to negotiate. I mean, they were there ready to crack some heads and stuff, and you know, we ended up with this agreement that we'd vacate this activity at 5:30, and for the most part, people did.
James Nickerson, president of the university, also asked them to leave. You know, you made your point. Traffic was backed up 10 miles or more, and the officers, Nicollet County, deputy sheriffs, North Mankato police, were excited. Highway patrol had to block off sections of the highway, and so the argument was that you proved your point. Now let's go, let's leave, let's go back to Mankato and go to, you know, finish the approved parade.
A new deadline was set by Nicollet County Sheriff George Whitty. Protesters said they would leave at 5:45. Whitty gave them until 5:20. At the deadline, Nickerson made one more plea, ending it somberly.
I'm sorry it's working out this way. Take care of yourselves, kids, and God bless you.
When students refused to leave, law enforcement fired fake tear gas canisters into the crowd. When that didn't work, authorities followed with real tear gas.
Tear gas was launched, and some of them picked up their shirts. The tear gas canister was hot. They threw the tear gas back at the officers that had launched the tear gas, and the officers then the wind shifted and the officers got the tear gas. And some people thought that was great fun. Well, then the wind shifted again in another series. This time the demonstrators got plenty of tear gas, and it filtered all the way. There were clouds of tear gas, clouds of tear gas.
For 20 minutes, the clash went on, with police entering the crowd with mace and clubs. At 5:40, Goodman made his first appearance at the roadblock and urged students to retreat and regroup at Front and Main. By 6 p.m., traffic was flowing again on Highway 169. The noon rally on campus drew 3,000 students, including 500 from nearby Gustavus Adolphus College. The main disagreement among the assembled students was whether to participate in another day of civil disobedience, advocated by Goodman, or protest peacefully with a silent march through town. Mark Carson, chair of the Political Science Department, urged,
"You're all ambassadors of peace. It would be ironic if the thing you hate most, violence, is the thing you become."
Goodman derided the silent march idea. He told the crowd,
"It won't make a damn bit of difference."
The rally ended at 1:20 p.m. when the college turned off the sound system. The silent march, with Nickerson among the protesters, lasted 3 hours.
To show their sincerity of issue, but also their interest in keeping it to a nonviolence, they held a second march, but this one was a visual march. And they had 5,000 people that day. And they marched 2 by 2 in silence down the hill, down to Riverfront, to Madison Avenue, up Madison Avenue, to Victory, and then back to the campus from there. And at one point I was standing on the corner of Front and Madison, and the start of the march was up Madison Avenue beyond the point that I could see them, and they hadn't come around the corner at Front and Main yet. And so it was, it was a massive march, and the whole group kept it absolutely silent. Anytime anybody in the group started to talk or carry on at all, people around them told them, this is serious stuff.
The march snaked up Madison Avenue to Madison East Shopping Mall. From there, it went along Highway 22 and back to campus. Along Highway 22, an agitated Goodman caught up with the marchers. Goodman asked,
"Do you like being tricked? You're just following Nickerson's parade. You have to do something with more impact."
Nickerson felt more in control Wednesday. He had kept the protesters focused and peaceful. At the end of the silent march, he praised the students for staying on the designated route.
"I'm proud of you for that, and I believe in you."
Thursday, May 11th, would be another trying day for Nickerson and the college. Nichols Hall was evacuated and closed at 11:15 a.m. because of a bomb threat. Morris Hall was evacuated and closed 45 minutes later for the same reason. The noon rally proceeded calmly until 50 students in the civil disobedience camp broke rank and marched down Valium Drive. Chief Alexander met the group at the foot of the hill and allowed them to proceed on the assurance that it was a peaceful march. But the protesters soon changed their mind and decided instead to occupy Old Main. They occupied the building at 3 p.m. and blocked exits with chairs and furniture. Non-involved students, faculty, and staff were ordered out of the building. Within 15 minutes, riot-equipped police arrived at the administration building to a jeering crowd of now 700 that had turned out on the front lawn of Old Main. When police arrived, students sprayed them with water from a fire hose. However, the incident ended quickly. No one was hurt, and the building was cleared by 3:30 p.m. A Pete Seeger concert Thursday evening had a cathartic effect on a week of rancor and bitterness. About 4,000 attended the concert, including many city residents. On Friday, May 12th, the disruptive week was not over. After a much smaller noon rally held on the campus mall, a group of 100 protesters marched down to Old Main to stage a sit-in. They told Nickerson and the college employees to leave the building, but Nickerson refused. He did agree to let them stage their sit-in if there would be no violence. Along the front balcony of Old Main, protesters hoisted a flag with a peace symbol and hung the American flag upside down. Inside, dogs ran about as protesters prepared to stay for the weekend. News of the potential threats against Goodman surfaced on Friday in a story in the Daily Reporter. Goodman claimed, because of death threats, Nickerson and Carson urged him to leave Mankato. Saturday afternoon, May 13th, Goodman arrived at Old Main to request a bodyguard in light of rumored threats against him earlier in the week. Nickerson agreed to meet with Goodman. During the encounter, Goodman became agitated and charged Nickerson with lack of concern over Goodman's personal safety. The bodyguard request was denied for the reason that Nickerson's security staff stated their resources were too strained to allocate someone to Goodman. Protesters left Old Main at 8 a.m. on Monday, May 15th, ending a peaceful weekend of occupation. It had been a trying 2 weeks for Nickerson. His office correspondence revealed the widespread of emotions that protests had evoked. One student wrote,
I do not support the protest. I do not feel you can end war and violence with violence. People are not going to listen when there is destruction to property and to human life. I hope to pass these views to some of my fellow students in hopes that they do not want violence. I write this small note to let you know there are still students at MSC who want to achieve peace. I do not know what to do about the situation at hand right now, except to let you know and others how I feel.
but Nickerson also had his supporters for his guidance of the campus in such an unsettled and unknowable chain of events. One area resident wrote,
How wonderful it is to have men of goodwill in a world so full of hate. You've been a tower of strength to the community, and I thank you for keeping us from a Kent state. I hope hateful critics will only spur you on to bring unity to our town.
Near the end of May, Goodman addressed a group of 200 to offer his reflections on his spring quarter at Mankato State College.
What is it that has caused this reaction to me that has a kind of hysteria?
Goodman called the atmosphere on the campus and in the town a witch hunt climate, and as he prepared to leave his term as the chair of ideas, he declared,
The lowest blow ever struck on me in my life came here at Mankato State.
On Friday, June 6, 1972, 1,200 Mankato State seniors graduated from college to enter a world full of confusion and a nation divided. Those who were freshmen 4 years earlier had seen life-changing events. They had observed and participated in one of the most unsettling periods in U.S. history. Looking back, Nickerson's legacy to Mankato State would lay in his ability to inspire change, to test new ideas, to foster growth, and to focus on long-range goals for the school. Nearly 40 years after the event, Nickerson would reflect on that month of May in 1972 and conclude that it was, all in all, a positive reflection of the American way. It was democracy in action.
The activism, the citizen and student demonstrations and so on are very legitimate. Well, not legitimate is not the right word. They're a very useful and necessary part of self-government. We can't get it all done through the forms that we have now. They don't quite do the job. And when you get into times of stress, there has to be this blow-off point. And the blow-off point is dangerous, yes, and can be misused. But it needs to be there, and it needs to be understood, as I feel, understood by those of us who would blow off. It has to be understood, the dangers of it, how it can get out of control. We in the town need to understand what it is that is going to be there. That our problems are not all solved and never be solved. And this is one, as I see it, one that, again, I get legitimate, and that's not the word I want. One very useful and necessary skill, and an attitude that we personally need to develop to understand and handle these kinds of things, whether we're official or whether we're the demonstrator, whatever it is. We've got to somehow fit it together.
Having lived through protests of the past, the Mankato community and Minnesota State University Mankato now understand how the push for change can bring conflict, and astute leadership can make a difference in the outcome of those events.
It's really important to know the history of activism in any community that you're in, because it says a lot about where you're from, and it says even more about where you can go. A lot of times people feel like they do not have the power to make change and that things are stagnant, but if students today realize that most great changes socially throughout the world, in this country, and on our own campus have been initiated, maintained, and led by university students and people of that age group, it can inspire us to continue creating change, and it can empower students to realize that they really are the change makers. They're the people who can make this world different and better than it is today. And without understanding where you come from, it's hard to envision that you have that power, and it's hard to understand where you can go.
Today, due to national developments and political polarization, student protests are active once again on campuses around the United States with movements like Black Lives Matter, Occupy, Stop the Keystone XL Pipeline, and Indivisible. As in the past, students continue to make their collective voices heard in the hopes that they too can bring positive change to their communities and to the world.
We'll take the power you couldn't hold. We'll take the office you would have sold. We'll take the damage you brought around. You take the bait. We'll take back this town. Roll up the window, tell my little girl, I know your heart is shaking, but the monsters won't move. Hold your breath, my baby, the air is sure to clear. They took their best shot, I'll take it from here.
Sitting high on Main Street, cops think we're fools. Say we don't know nothing, just a party after school. Love it or leave it, heard it all before. We can shut down your streets, we can shut down your war.
We'll take the power you couldn't hold. We'll take the office you would have sold. We'll take the damage you brought around. You take the bait. We'll take back this town.
Emeritus, and he taught American history at MSU from 1964 to 2003. And for many years, he has researched the Mankato State College anti-war movement as well as the national campus movement. Professor Strasser has the distinction of being one of the original participants in the anti-war movement on the Mankato campus. And he knew President Nickerson very well and considered him a good friend. Currently, Don is in retirement and has been enjoying traveling the world with his wife, Dr. Melody Andrews. And next to Don is Dan Quillin, who served as the Student Senate and president of the Minnesota State College Student Association from 1971 to 1972. He graduated from Mankato State College in 1972 with a degree in social studies. And in 1975, Dan was appointed to serve on the Minneapolis City Council. He later went on to have a productive 38-year career with the state of Minnesota, where he worked as a project manager and a supervisor in the Information Technology Office of the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development. He's retired from the state, and he did that in 2014. Dan has been a member of the advisory board of Minnesota State Mankato College of Social and Behavioral Sciences since 2006. And he sits on the board of Isaiah, is that right? Isaiah, which is a statewide interfaith social justice organization. In the middle here, we have Mark Halverson, who came to Mankato State College in the fall of 1969 when he decided to go to college at the last minute, in part because of the looming draft. The 1970 Kent and Jackson State tragedies had a significant impact on Mark, and in the fall of 1970, he ran for Student Senate. There he served 3 terms as a senator, including one as the speaker. While the Mankato State College Student Senate was involved in a variety of activities, the protests against the war were the central activity. After Mark graduated in 1973, he stepped away from activism while still remaining somewhat involved, and he worked as a railroad brakeman and went on to obtain a law degree from Hamline University. He later returned to Mankato, where he has practiced law for many years. Mark has been involved in numerous community activities, which include being the county chair of a major political party. He also hosts several popular blues radio programs at KMSU and the radio station on campus. So very talented. So on this side, we have David Cowen, who came to Mankato State College in 1966 and proceeded to become involved in student government issues such as removing dorm mothers from residence halls and ending curfews. In May of 1970, after 4 deaths at Kent State and 2 deaths at Jackson State, Cowen became secretary of the newly formed Strike Coordinating Committee, which was created by student government leaders to serve as a campus information clearinghouse. In June of 1970, before 5,000 people in the Highland Arena, he gave a 22-minute commencement speech on how graduates were critical in helping to bridge the gap between what appeared to be a society reduced to 2 extreme choices: revolution or reaction, when it came to the Vietnam War. This was the first speech given by a student at a 4-year state college in the state of Minnesota. David Cowen is now the Facility Services Director at Minnesota State Mankato, but is known by most in his capacity as Parking and Transportation Administrator. And finally, I'd like to introduce John Anderson, who came to Mankato State College after being discharged from the United States Army in 1970. While at Mankato State College, he was elected to Student Senate and the Student Union Board. John also became a member of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, where he became involved in activities directed at ending the Vietnam War. He received both a BA in 1974 and an MA in 1975 from Minnesota State Mankato. After graduation, John went on to work for nonprofits and state and local government for 35 years. In the last 25 years, he served as a policy budget analysis for the Governor's State Crime Commission and the State Department of Human Services. Currently, John is retired and devotes his time to volunteer projects, and he continues to be involved in the peace movement as a member of Vets for Peace. So that's our panel. Please give them a warm welcome and a round of applause. So at this point, we turn it over for discussion, and I'm going to start us off with our first question, and then we'll take it from there. We have a couple mics in the on stage, and we'll have 2 in the audience. So if you want a mic, just raise your hand, and we'll bring you one. And question 1 is, I'm going to direct this to each of our panel members. So what do you think is the most important thing for us to take away from the events represented in the film today? And I'll let whoever wants to start.
Can you hear me? I think the most important thing, or one of the most important things, was that participation in anti-war activity transformed these students' lives. That's what they told me at the time and afterward. Now, there's a war correspondent named Chris Hedges, and he said, sadly, war is a force that gives meaning to our lives. And I think that is a sad observation, even if it may be true. Are our lives so empty that we need war for excitement and commitment to something? So I would argue that it was this participation in this activity with all their comrades that actually gave meaning to their lives and transformed them. And I would like, if you permit, to read an email from one of those students who wrote to me in January of 1998. Her name is Susan Odell. And she wrote, "My friends and I were on campus, not only with anti-war events, but setting up a number of community-based services, a hotline, abortion, pregnancy services, a drug walk-in center, etc. It was really an active time of social change in Mankato, and not always with the support of the larger non-college community. We had a big people's picnic. We had big people's picnics at whatever the big park is in Mankato. Of course, that's Sibley Park. I remember how supportive Police Chief Alexander was of our efforts. I graduated in 1971 and went to graduate school in social work at the University of Minnesota. My professional commitment to social justice and social work really came out of my early years at Mankato State. I now have a PhD in clinical social work, and I have a full-time private practice in Chicago. I like the fact that my values and commitments to social justice continue to be part of the work I do every day." And then she goes on to say, "I have been very fortunate to have traveled fairly recently twice to Vietnam, once to Hanoi and north, and the second time on a bike trip where we cycled from Hanoi to Saigon. Being able to personally experience the impact of that war on Vietnam is an experience I will always cherish." In parentheses, she wrote, "The Vietnam War in Vietnam is called the American War." Of course it would be, but also jarring the first time I heard a Vietnamese person refer to the war in this way. And so I think that's an example of what happened to many of those students. They went on to do social work. And this is true nationally. Those who were involved in the campus protests across the nation, many of those students went on to become teachers or social workers or active in the environmental movement, but something that was contributing to the welfare of society. And so I think it was a very positive movement, a positive activity for students to be involved in. I'll turn it over to the others.
I would say that one of the lessons I learned as a result of this entire effort is that you can make a difference, you can make change, you can persuade the public to a new position. When this whole effort started, it took many years before the public eventually embraced the position that the war in Vietnam was a bad idea. And it takes persistence and involvement. And then the other takeaway would be that we as students that were involved learned so much and developed our own personal development occurred as a result of this involvement outside the classroom. So those are two takeaways for me.
Well, I agree with Dan on that point. We were face to face with university presidents, system administrators, county sheriffs. I was 17 years old when this started, 21 when it was done. It kind of set me on a course for life. I think, to be trite about it, one lesson I've learned is to think globally but act locally. This protest business was going on across the whole country, the whole world, but we brought it home to Mankato. It changed a lot of minds locally, but it changed the course of this whole country. Don read a passage about someone who was doing abortion counseling. Well, while this was going on, when we were on campus, that's when the Roe v. Wade decision came down. So that's not history for us, but right now, the swing vote on the Supreme Court sits in limbo in all likelihood, and I can see this country taking a big step backwards if people don't start getting active. And you can do things right here, but people listen in a broader context. And I'm going to pass it on to Dave. The only thing that hasn't changed since I left here in 1973 is Dave Cowen still works for the university.
Back then, this campus was split, not only over the sentiments of the war in Vietnam, but physically it was split. You had the Valley campus, you had the Upper campus, and if you've ever tried to organize anything, it's very difficult when they're not there. They're over here, they're over there. There were no cell phones. The things we did was probably smoke signals, maybe something like that, a bullhorn, but that didn't reach very far. But the neat thing for me was that the campus finally got together on the big issues. And it was mentioned that dorm mothers were a fright when I came here as a student, and they were. And we did get rid of them, but we didn't harm them. We did not harm them. Let that go out, that we did not harm them. We got rid of them. We got rid of the beanies. We used to have beanies. We got rid of those. And the campus used to be full of folks that thought that students had to be protected. It was called in loco parentis. So the parents would hand off the son or daughter to the university, which would then protect the students. But you know, all of that kind of melted away because the war seemed to take a life of its own, and the importance of seeing 20, 30,000 people of our ilk, of our age, being killed and hundreds of thousands maimed, not to mention the folks in South Vietnam and North Vietnam being murdered and bombed. To what end is the big issue? Well, it made all this other stuff seem so stupid, you know, just so ridiculous. And classes, to me, didn't make all that much, it didn't have all that much importance anymore because there was this huge thing called the war. Now, that war didn't last that long, but there is another war going on. It's lasted far longer. I wonder if we're ever going to see any movement to end that war. It's called Afghanistan.
Well, I don't think so. Not for a while. I don't think. I think it's going to be the way it is right now. When I was in the Army, is when Kent State happened. I was about ready to get out in a couple months, and Kent State was all over the TV, and there was a big discussion, we'll put it, between the anti-war people in the Army who were anti-war, and then the other soldiers, so to speak. Most of the people I knew before I got out were ready to become veterans, and more I saw anti-war veterans. So when I came to Mankato, and the reason I came is because although I'm from the state of New York, at that time, Mankato offered veterans in-state tuition, so it was a no-brainer right there. So I came and first ran into the Vets Club, which were not anti-war or pro-war that I could see. They just liked to drink a lot. Then I did run into more and more veterans, and I think, I don't know if it was the Student Senate or somebody had what they called a be-in or something like that, where anybody could get up in the student union and talk about the war. So a number of us veterans got up there, and afterwards I did get interviewed by my late friend Harvey T. Rockwood, and I was friends until the end with Harvey. And the more veterans started talking about how we hated the war, and I was an air evacuation medic, so I saw a lot that I didn't want to see. And when I came to Mankato and saw that the students were much more enlightened than I thought they would be, and I thought also when I got here, us veterans would probably be cursed upon as some of us were at different places, and considered drug addicts and everything else. But we were accepted in the anti-war movement, and we did a lot of work with the Student Mobilization Committee and learned how to take a goal and try our best to come to the conclusion. But unfortunately, it didn't happen till the protests we had here, while they were meaningful, a lot of us, especially veterans, were pretty much disillusioned because nothing really was happening. So a lot of us ended up going to protests in DC and up in Minneapolis and other places just to see what was really happening. And that's when I ran into John Kerry, and we convinced, somehow, we convinced the university to have a conference for Vietnam Veterans Against War. And that's when John Kerry came here, and I think Senator Vance also spoke at that. And realized that maybe this thing is really going to end. The problem was there were two schools of thought. One was nonviolence. The other one was, of course, the violent era. And that's the reason Kerry left Vietnam Veterans Against War, is because it was getting a little too emotional and a little violent for him, because we all realized as we got to know John more and more that he was in it for politics. And we knew he was going to be a politician at some point in time, and he was. So, but I think as far as being at Mankato, at the time, it was a good time. It was a good time to be a student. It was a good time to get your thoughts heard. And I still think being a student at Mankato is still the best time I had in my life.
So now I'd like to open it up to the audience. Do you have questions for our panel? question?
Well, if they don't, let me throw in this. We had a governor by the name of Wendell R. Anderson, and he had a sidekick, the executive secretary, oh yes, Tom Kilm. Now, for me, 1970, when the Ohio governor, was it Rhodes, put those troops on a college campus, that was a shocker to me because college campuses were a sanctuary for intellectualism and liberal thought and peace and love and all of that stuff. And then suddenly you had 19, 18-year-old National Guardsmen walking around shooting people. Now you have to understand the thought, 2 years later now, we were having all these protests, and we had this governor and his sidekick, Tom Kilm. Tom Kilm was, talk about a politician, Tom Kilm was the worst of the worst. And so when these protests were going on for 2 weeks in May of 1972, there was, and I know this because I was there was pressure on the part of the governor and his executive secretary, Tom Kilm, to take it out of the hands of the local police, to take it out of the hands of MSU. We didn't have much of a security system. And put in troops and quell the demonstrations. And this was a real thing. This was a real thing to worry about because they came very close on at least 2 different occasions when they almost were ordered out. But Nickerson, to his credit, was able to convince the governor and his sidekick not to do the stupid thing that Ohio did 2 years before and put 19-year-old troops with loaded weapons to face 19-year-old students who were screaming anti-war slogans. So just to understand the dynamic, you were talking about earlier about, you saw in the film where a Molotov cocktail or what have you was thrown up against an armory building. I mean, it was solid wall, so that's not going to burn down. But when people are meeting people and people are screaming at people and people are shouting obscenities at people, and you're young and you're excited and things happen, well, the worst can happen. They say, you know, you unleash the dogs of war. Well, truly, even on a campus, which was supposed to be a sanctuary, that occurred at Kent. We were terrified, at least I was, in 1972. Dan Quillin can speak to it as Halverson, that that stuff would happen all over again in Mankato, and it didn't. Nobody was killed in these demonstrations.
Been here. Can you hear me? Okay. You might, from the film, get the impression that the students took to the streets almost immediately when they turned against the war. But that's misleading. The students did everything possible that a citizen can do in a democracy before they entered the streets. They drew up petitions, and circulated the petitions. They wrote letters to their congresspersons. They took buses to Washington and confronted their elected representatives. They attended forums and teach-ins on the campus. That's how they were educated about the war. They canvassed the community, which took more guts than I had, to go out, knock on doors at North Mankato and try to explain to the residents why they were against the war and what their opinions might have been. They have, of course, attended campus rallies and demonstrations. They appealed to the MSC Faculty Senate. They actually carried in a flag-draped coffin into the Faculty Senate meeting as a demonstration and tried to persuade faculty who were not against the war to change their minds. And also to get the Faculty Senate to go on record that, and the Faculty Senate did this, they passed a resolution that they would not participate in research in military weapons, which was the case at the University of Wisconsin and other state universities. And of course, they appealed to President Nickerson, who I think, along with Alexander, the police chief, were the ones responsible for keeping the protests from getting out of hand and becoming destructive. And you heard me in the film criticize the Pied Piper, whom I thought, Goodman, who I thought was leading the students in the wrong direction, and away from what we thought the protest was all about. What were we really doing? Well, we were trying to send a message to Washington, that was for sure. But we were also trying to convince our friends and neighbors that the war was wrong. And we eventually succeeded. The polls would show by 1970 that 70%, that's a big percentage of the American people, excuse me, not only thought the war was wrong, but that it was immoral.
Come to my mind consistently in about 50 years is that politics involves a good deal of demagoguery. When we were here in 1972, it was someone named Richard Nixon. I think at the time we thought he was about as bad as he would get. Some of us have changed our minds. But he would bait people. He had a vice president named Spiro Agnew who had to resign because he was a criminal. There's some parallels here. But they would court protesters to support their position of people like us, minorities, women, just being uprisers. He called what, the nabobs of negativism or something like that. Yeah. But this comes to mind particularly now because our, I call him our fake president, is going to be making an appearance over in Rochester in a couple days. Well, Nixon went to Rochester during the '72 campaign, and Dan maybe remembers this. People came to the Student Senate and offered to fund several buses so we could take protesters over there and disrupt his rally and hence fuel his blue-collar crowd. He's kind of playing back then to the same crowd that our president is now, polarizing this whole country. So you need to be aware of what's going on in the background here, but I haven't heard of a bus going over to Rochester from here now, but they just might not have thought of that yet.
Just share, one of the challenges during that period was basically deciding how far to go in the protest. Mitchell Goodman made a determination that the means, or the ends justified the means, and that we needed to basically shut down the college, shut down the road in order to draw public attention to this, to the war effort. And for many of us, we ended up having to try and make a personal decision about how far were we willing to go to try and stop what we thought was this unjust war. And this really accelerated when the bombing and the quarantine of Haiphong and Hanoi occurred, because there was many of us thought that it was only one step away from getting into a land war with China. So the stakes we felt were really high, and it made this decision of how far to go, whether it be Mitchell, Goodman, or just peaceful protest, it created a lot of soul searching. And I think that this kind of issue repeats itself in our lifetimes, and we all end up trying to reconcile how far we're willing to go to support our beliefs.
Pick up from about the morality of the war. And the thing is that when I was in the service, you were taught to be immoral, that the enemy needs to be dead, and it doesn't matter how you do it. And if you don't do it, they'll come and they'll get you in the evening. So I think a lot of that immoral stuff that comes from war is taught by the military madness to begin with. And even though I was a veteran, I was part of the war effort. I'm not happy about it. A lot of times it still pisses me off, but, and I'm glad it finally ended. But now we've got, how many we got going on now? 5? So I don't think the military madness is going away anytime soon. And especially when Trump came in office, he wanted to know, why don't we use nuclear bombs more? That kind of stuff really kind of gets me jittery, wondering if I'm going to wake up in the morning and things are going to be a whole bit different. So that's what I wanted to talk about in terms of the military madness anyway. And it's still there.
Really so much have a question as a comment. I was a student here from 1969 to 1973, and I just want to express my appreciation for what all of you did during that period of my life. I was one of the faces in the marchers there. I was not a organizer, but my life was on the line in the sense that if I didn't keep my grades up, I was going to be chased after by the military, and was. So I specifically, or especially want to thank you, John, for your service, and all of you for what you did to hasten the end to that war. When I graduated, I received an induction notice to show up at the bus depot, which was down in the corner of, 2nd and Cherry, I think, at that time. I did not go to that bus ride. And the next day, the war was ended. So I was very lucky, but I do think that the efforts that all of you put in to keep this in front of the American people, and Mankato people in particular, did help to bring that war to an end. And I'm glad I was a part of that scene. And I would agree with you, John. My time at Mankato State and what that experience during that war taught me has stayed with me to this day. And I will agree with you, Mark, and say I hope we can get a bus load over to Rochester on Thursday, because the show goes on and we need to resist. Not particularly.
Well, thanks for your help.
To correct, I'd like to correct a some misunderstanding about who opposed the war and who didn't. And this, I'm speaking nationally, and how this played out here in Mankato, I'm not absolutely sure. But opposition to the war was inversely proportioned to your wealth and your education. The more money you had, the more education you had, the more likely you would support the establishment and support the war. Blue-collar workers generally tended to favor withdrawal from Vietnam. Now that is counter to what most people believe. They believe that blue-collar workers were all ready to beat up the protesters all the time, and that they were for the war. But a Gallup poll in January of 1971 showed that 60% of those with a college education favored withdrawal from the war. But 75% of those with only a high school education favored withdrawal from the war. And those with only a grade school education, 80% of them favored withdrawal from the war. So those with wealth and power, they had a stake in the war that the rest of us didn't. And that may explain why we had mostly working class students here at Mankato State, and we still do. And they did not have a stake in the establishment. And President Nickerson and the rest of us that met with him frequently after years, these later years, they had meetings at his apartment, and we puzzled over this. How did we get 3,000 and sometimes 5,000 students out demonstrating and marching when we had an enrollment of about 15,000? I mean, that's amazing. To get maybe a third of the campus involved in this activity. And you go to any other university or college at the time, I don't think you'll see that. I think we had the highest percentage of students in the movement than any other college and university, including the University of Minnesota at that time. And I'm not quite sure about why this was, but I think the working class background had something to do with that.
So I guess the old adage of rich man's war, poor man's fight, still, and I think it's still pretty accurate.
Audience?
Do I? Okay, awesome. Okay, so I just wanted to ask, this question is particularly for Dr. Strasser. What was it, we've heard about the students, but what was it like for faculty? What was it, how were faculty divided, or what was the scope there, and what was it like being a professor at that time?
I thought you'd never asked. It was the best of times, and it was the worst of times. For me, as a faculty member, I came here in 1964. By the time we get to 1972, I'm 37. Now, Mark down here would probably believed, I don't know that he actually said it, but the saying at the time was, don't believe anybody over 30. Don't trust them. Well, anyway, I started out.
I'm your age now.
in 1965 opposing the war when President Johnson widened the war and made it all-out war on the Asian mainland, okay? I got petitions from a national organization. I began to put them up in Old Main, where we're located, and I put them up on the bulletin boards. In fact, I went into the vice president's office and scared the daylights out of a secretary, because I went up to her and I said, I'm going to do this, and I want the vice president to know it, and I'm not asking for permission, I'm telling you what I'm doing. And she got all flustered, but I went out and I put the petitions up. And a point we should make is that the students didn't start the movement. To their credit, they took it over and made it their own and ran with it, and that's how we know about it, what we know of it. You know, it's the student movement. But students didn't take my petitions seriously. Some wrote Mickey Mouse instead of a formal name. Some just took a match and lit the petitions and burned it. But when the war came home for them, they turned against it and joined the movement. Now, the first anti-war activity in Mankato was by John Foster of the English department and Clarence Parashow, I believe, of the math department. They went down to the post office and took up a vigil with signs opposing the war. Eventually, they were joined by Abbas Kessel, whom you saw in the film, and then I joined them. So eventually there were 4 of us. I was a Johnny-come-lately, but what was it like for a faculty member? Well, we had all the responsibilities that a faculty member has: to teach our classes, prepare for our classes, teach our classes, advise students, do committee work, all kinds of administrative things that go along with as well as your teaching. And of course we had to have a life, and I had a family. So you've got to figure out how you're going to use your time. And well, students had to do the same thing, but we had different obligations than some of them did. Some of them were married and had families of their own too. Now, as far as the faculty that were against the war, they tended to be from the College of Humanities and the Social Sciences. And those who tended to favor the war or were at least not committal tended to be in the College of Business, you might expect, and also in the physical sciences. Now, there were exceptions, of course. But this was true not only here at MSC, but I found across the country that most of the faculty that were anti-war were from the humanities and social services, social sciences, excuse me. It was difficult to come out against the war. You had to teach your classes, and you had to be as objective as you can be in your classes and not bring the war into the classroom unless that was appropriate. And so you had to do this. It seemed sometimes totally divorced from what was going on out there on the wall. But I got up, I lived 2 blocks from the campus. Every morning I got up, as soon as I stepped out my door, I could hear the music blaring up here on the campus. And of course you could hear the music blasting into the classrooms at times too. So it was difficult. And we had the bomb scares, and none of that seemed to be associated with the anti-war movement. Somebody was always ready to take an exam they didn't want to take, and so we had the bomb scares. And as far as the person who blew up the law enforcement center, the city manager told me later that they knew who it was. He had fled the state. He was out east somewhere, and they were not going to go after him, or they couldn't. But that he was not really a student, or if he may have taken a class here, but his beef was with the police over drugs. So, you know, you couldn't lay that on the anti-war movement. In fact, there was hardly any destruction compared to what happened at other universities.
But what some of us could not understand is how our national leaders could continue to lie and lie and lie to us. Now remember, this was 50 years ago, and they haven't quit that habit. Nothing's changed. But yeah, Lyndon Baines Johnson promised us that no American boys would be doing what Asian boys should be doing, and that was in 1964 when he was running against Barry Goldwater, the Republican. He was the Democrat. Nixon put a new shine on everything, Tricky Dicky, or whatever they called him. By the way, most of these people are so far left, I'm not sure. But I was the only Republican back in those days amongst this group, and now I don't know what I am anymore. But here we go. The lying was really something else. And of course, now we all know they were lying, but we suspected they were lying at the time. But, you know, we had people, I had friends of mine dead. I went to a lot of funerals. How do you go to a funeral when you're 22? This was tough. You go to a funeral now when you're 70 because people die in our age, but we were going to far too many funerals and finding our friends coming back from the war in Vietnam without limbs. This is also what motivated some of us to get into the anti-war movement.
Question from the audience. Where is it? Here. Oh, it's Matt. Okay, sure.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the circumstances where Mitchell Goodman was brought in and invited to the university, because it really seems, if you look at his broader strategies, that they weren't really too different from the other strategies that were being entertained. I mean, he might have been a little bit more confrontational, but when we're talking civil disobedience and shutting things down, I mean, it's not like he's like Carlton and Dwight Armstrong blowing up buildings at the University of Wisconsin. So, you know, so his radicalism isn't, you know, that deranged Molotov cocktail, blow up buildings, Weatherman style that I think sometimes is implied. So is part of it perhaps the circumstances that he was brought in? Because it struck me too that when he comes in, first of all, when he's brought in as chair of ideas, I wonder what people thought they were getting. He had a very established anti-war record with the Pentagon protests, the Boston 5 trial, so forth and so on. And also it's you know, the events that are described in the film, it's May 72. This is really late in the war. It's almost effectively over. The Paris Peace Accords are in January of 73. So can you talk a little bit about just the timing when Goodman's brought in and just how those tensions kind of blew up? Like, was there some camaraderie at the start that just got derailed, or how did that work?
Well, I think that this was a committee that was mostly students, but some faculty. It had grown out of a dispute a few years before. I think everyone knew exactly what they were getting with him. I think what was different about him is he knew he was only here for, we had quarters then, so it was a very short time. He wasn't a career academician anywhere. He already had a national profile. He was known for doing what he was doing, but knowing the people that bought him here, like I said in the film, before he even got here, we knew that he was going to be organizing anti-war protests, and we knew there was going to be some problems class listed on the curriculum we could sign up for, and that would be our class project. He was maybe a figurehead and a focal point for some of this, but this was happening all over the country, all over the world. It had happened here before he came. We had fairly similar events after Kent and Jackson State. They got progressively bigger, but I think to pin a lot of this on Mitchell Goodman really isn't very accurate. He was more visible than most. He was an adult. He, like I said in the movie, he was actually part of the administration here. He was part of the faculty, but I think most of this probably would have happened anyway. And to say he was leading a bunch of blind college students, I think, is an insult to us, actually. Mr. Strasser. Collegiately, yeah.
I would just add that I think at that time, the Student Senate and the Chair of Ideas, we wanted to bring somebody in who would really challenge the students. And we saw Mitchell Goodman had a reputation. He had been part of the Boston Five. So we thought there was a desire to make the Chair of Ideas a more challenging position than it had been previously. And I think that the student body or the student government felt that this is an individual who would challenge us, and he certainly did.
We didn't know what course the war was going to take necessarily either.
A little here. I didn't disagree with Mitchell Goodman as some might think. It was not what he thought and so much what he said, but I agreed with Abbas Kessel that we should not shut the university down. Kessel believed that would play right into Nixon's hands. If we shut the universities down, everybody will go home. There will be no protest movement. And actually, of course, we did end up shutting down the university towards the end of the spring quarter because of fear for violence and harm to the students. We worked out a suspension of the classes and a way for students to get credit for the work that they had done. And that was up to a negotiation between the students and their individual professors. But to shut the university down during the year, we thought would end the movement. I mean, students always went home during the summer. How do you sustain it? We were protesting over the years. And how do you sustain a protest if they're all going home?
Yep. My name is Karen. I'm a faculty member here. I would have loved to have been a part of it with you guys at that time, but I wasn't old enough, sorry. And I know we're just about done, but I just wondered one thing, and it's probably Pink Floyd over here is going to have to be the one to answer it, but I have a friend who was in the Vietnam War too, and he, I'd say he was pretty messed up because of it, these 45 years later. But he was, if he was sitting here right now, he would be so hurt because of the, the people that had protested. And not that I agree with him, but I understand where he's coming from. And to this day, he is still, he still talks about Hanoi Jane and, and all that kind of stuff. So that's why I'm asking you probably mostly because you're a vet and you were in Vietnam. What would you say to him, though? And I guess part of it, are there other vets who didn't make you feel very good about yourself for participating? So what would you tell Jim And what should I tell Jim?
I don't know. It's on, okay. I have run into a number of pro-war vets in the past, and we have always agreed to disagree. And I think a lot of times it has to do what your job was in the military. And I think if I were to try to classify it, I think most of the infantry was pro-war. I shouldn't say most, but a lot of the pro-war veterans I ran into were in the infantry and had it tough. And then there were the medics like me who had to deal with the afterburn, so to speak. I was sickened the first time I had to deal with a medical problem, and then I also was. They put me on the psych wards too, which made it even worse because these guys, a lot of them just went ballistic when they were even in basic training. I can remember I was at Fort Dix at the time, and I had to take a patient down to Walter Reed because he kept trying to kill himself. And the interesting thing about that is once he got to Walter Reed and we got a report on him, once they decided they better discharge him, all of a sudden he was fine. So, I mean, that takes some commitment to try to kill yourself and bang your head against the walls just because you didn't want to be in. But in terms of people that were in and came back thinking we should have done more, I don't know how to address that. I really don't.
I don't think that he's pro-war, and I don't think he wished he could have done more. He talks about how he was treated when he came back, and spit on all of that kind of stuff, and that's why I'm saying he feels like people deserted the guys that were there. That's what I think. I don't think he's pro-war at all.
Well, a lot of the veterans in Vietnam, Veterans Against the War and Vets for Peace, that had happened to. Not as many as the media says, but there were people, especially if you got in at, if you came in through San Francisco or Oakland, that happened a lot. And
That's where he came in San Francisco.
yeah, and they would wait at the airport and just wait for one of the planes to come in full of veterans of the war to get off the plane and just harass them. And I don't know how, I guess time is the great healer, I don't know. But at that time, the country was split just like it is now. And I don't know what the answer would be at this point 40 years later. Your guess is as good as mine right now, I'm sorry.
One more question, if there's one out here, or a couple more comments?
Thank you. My question comes from the gentleman back here who said he was contacted to go to report to the bus, and you didn't show up, but the war ended the next day. Is that correct? Okay. So my question is, if there were so many protesters, if they were called to go to the war and didn't go, what happened? Were these people jailed? Were they
had
declaring a conscientious objector status?
They
Or
had
just
two
what
options.
happened?
It was either a CO or they would be put in jail for the term that they would have served, which would have been 3 years. Actually, 2 years if they were drafted. So I can remember going to the bus too, only I had to go all the way to Buffalo, and Buffalo, New York, and from there to Newark before I got down to basic training. But there were a few that kind of disappeared before the bus got there. So there.
Canada?
Pardon?
Canada?
That's a good guess. I thought of Canada, but both my parents were veterans, so I decided, well, I'll go. And what they allowed me to do once I did get a draft notice was to sign up for another year, and I could pick whatever I wanted to do. And at that point, I thought, well, being a medic shouldn't be so bad, should it? I was wrong. I should have picked a company clerk or something, but that's what they got. They got punished, or they could go in the military and go down to Fort Sam Houston, where they where they trained conscientious objectors to be medics, and that was another option for them.
And I think this is our last one. Someone has the microphone. One.
There we go. With the whole bunch of the bombs going off in the police station, the gas throwing into Morris Hall, the police throwing gas on you guys, and just Goodman kind of egging you on a little bit further, at any point did you guys kind of almost get tired of it and just thought it's getting too much to handle with all the people throwing gas and kind of almost getting too violent? What were your guys' thoughts when that started to happen?
It didn't happen every day. You realize that the protest was going on almost every day while we were in session. But you know, the gassing in the halls and the bomb threats, yeah, we got tired of them, certainly, but we couldn't do anything about them. And there were some faculty that refused to let their students out of the class and continued class even though we were under bomb threat. Well, I wouldn't take that responsibility for my students. We always went out when we were directed to. Yeah, it was irksome. But what could you do? So that was one of the bad things.
I think there was kind of an interesting dichotomy throughout the country, not necessarily so much on campus where we were all somewhat sheltered, but this was about the time the 60s were getting to Minnesota, 1972 and 1970. And there was kind of a hippie back to the country movement. A lot of people did kind of tune in, turn on, and drop out. But also, there was a pretty large contingent of people that thought there literally would be a revolution. And the way that things were happening in the country about then, I think every major city had a significant race riot with, sections of town burned, race protests everywhere. We had the Black Panthers, who were not necessarily inherently a militant group, but they got painted that way. There was a lot of serious militants around, and some people dropped out, but some people, I think, probably did get a little more aggressive. I think a lot of us here kind of wrote it out. This was a relatively short time frame. The draft ended in February of 1972. I know that date well because the next quarter I caught up about 30 credits of incompletes and got out of here. But that kind of let the pressure out. The war was ending, although it ended kind of on a sour note. Some people are still fighting it, like it was referred to a minute ago. But I think people moved on to different things. The students grew up, and some of us are still pretty active, but a lot of people aren't. And it got passed on to your generation is what happened.
That will wrap us up for the evening. I want to thank our panel again, Dr. Don Strasser, Dan Quillin, Mark Halverson, David Cowen, and John Anderson for that great discussion. And thank you all for coming. We're at the end of our time. And I just would like to encourage you to fill out those surveys for us. We'd really appreciate your feedback. And we'll collect them at the door. And thank you so much for this program, for coming to our program.